Every few hundred years, somebody comes roaring out of the grasslands and damn near conquers the world. You've heard the names: the Huns, the Turks, and the biggest of them all, the Mongols, who in a single lifetime built the largest connected empire the world has ever seen. From the rice paddies of China to the gates of Europe, more land than Rome took in centuries, swallowed in a few decades by a people who, a generation before, had been a scatter of feuding tribes nobody outside the steppe had ever heard of. Now, the usual way to tell this story is to make it about one man, a genius, Genghis Khan, the strategic mastermind, the conqueror of the age, and he was extraordinary. I'll give him every ounce of that before we're done. But I've spent my whole life around people who live off animals in open country, and that telling always rang a little hollow to me, because it skips the strangest part, the part nobody wants to slow down and look at. These people didn't build the deadliest army in history. They didn't train it up from scratch, the way a kingdom does. They already had it, and they had it without trying, because of how they lived every ordinary day. The most fearsome war machine the world had ever seen wasn't an invention. It was a side effect. Let me show you what I mean. To see what made the steppe so dangerous, you first have to see how much work it takes everybody else to field an army. And here a farming empire is the perfect thing to measure against. A settled kingdom. China, Persia, the European states, is rich. Rich in grain, in cities, in people. But here is the catch nobody pictures. Almost none of those people know how to fight. A farmer spends his life bent over a field. His hands know the plow, not the bow. The kingdom has to make soldiers from scratch, and it is enormously expensive. You have to pull men off the land, which means the crops suffer. You have to feed them, arm them, and train them for months or years, because a man who has never held a weapon is worse than useless in a battle line. You have to build a whole separate machine, a supply train, dragging food across hundreds of miles because soldiers don't grow their own grain on the march. And the horses a farming state has to specially breed and stable war horses at ruinous cost. The way I told you the Han did, mares guarded like treasure. I've seen what it costs to turn a ranch hand into a fighting man. And a settled empire pays that cost 100,000-fold every single time it goes to war. Soldiering for them is a separate thing from living. A second life a man has to be dragged into and trained up for. Hold on to that. Because on the steppe, it was the exact opposite. On the steppe, there was no line between living and soldiering. They were the same thing. Every single skill that makes a deadly cavalryman, a nomad was already practicing. Not as training, but as Tuesday. Start with the horse. A settled empire pays a fortune to breed and keep war horses. A steppe child is put on a horse before he can properly walk. By the time he is a man, he and the horse are one animal. He doesn't learn to ride into battle. He has never known a day off a horse in his life. And he doesn't own one horse, the way a knight does. He owns a string of them, and switches mounts on the move. So, a Mongol army could cover ground at a pace that left settled armies thinking they were being hit by ghosts. Now the bow. A farmer has to be taught archery late, badly. A steppe boy is handed a small bow as a toddler and sent to shoot birds and rats for the pot. Hunting isn't a sport out there. It is how the family eats on a thin day. So by manhood, every single one of them is a lifelong marksman who can put an arrow through a moving target from the back of a galloping horse. The single hardest thing to do with a weapon, and to him it is just how you catch dinner. And the big tribal hunts, the whole community riding out and circling a valley full of game, tightening the ring, driving the animals, signaling across miles with flags and riders. Think about what that is. It is not a hunt. It is a military maneuver. It is an entire army practicing encirclement, communication, and coordinated movement, and calling it getting food. You see it now, everything a kingdom paid a fortune and bled for years to teach. Riding, shooting, moving as a unit, living rough off the land. The nomad had for free, baked into the most ordinary business of staying alive. He wasn't trained for war. He was raised as war, and never knew it was anything special. But now you've got a problem. A good one, the kind that cracks the whole thing open. If every nomad was born a soldier, if the steppe was always full of these natural-born cavalry, then why didn't they conquer the world all the time? Why did the settled empires survive at all for thousands of years, right next door to that? Because of the one thing the steppe could never make for itself: unity. Here is the cruel arithmetic of grassland life. The land is poor and thin. It can't feed crowds in one place. The herds need room, so the people have to spread out, scatter across enormous distances just to survive. And scattered people fight each other, for grazing, for water, for animals. The steppe was 1,000 small, deadly tribes, every one of them full of natural soldiers, and every one of them pointing those soldiers at the tribe over the next ridge. All that military power, and it canceled itself out. A loaded gun with the barrel bent back on itself. The deadliest fighters on Earth, spending their whole ferocity killing each other over a waterhole. Generation after generation, the settled empires didn't survive because they were stronger. They survived because the steppe was too busy fighting itself to ever come for them all at once. So the real question of this whole story was never, how do you train an army? The army was already there, 1,000,000 strong, waiting. The real question was, who could ever get all of them to point the same direction at once? For thousands of years, the answer was nobody. And then came the boy. His name was Temujin, and he was born about as low as the steppe gets. His father was poisoned by rivals when the boy was young. His family was abandoned by their own clan, left on the open grass to starve. A widow and her children, which on the steppe was close to a death sentence. He grew up hunted, hungry, and betrayed, learning young the one lesson that would build an empire, that the tribal world he was born into, all those shifting loyalties and blood feuds, was broken, and a man who survived it owed it nothing. So when he started to rise, he didn't just win battles. Anybody on the steppe could win a battle. He did something nobody had ever managed. He went after the disunity itself. He smashed the old order on purpose, where the steppe had always organized by blood. Your clan, your tribe, your ancient enemies. He tore it up and reorganized his people by loyalty and merit instead. He broke up the conquered tribes and scattered their men through his army so the old tribal lines dissolved. He promoted men who'd been nobodies, herdsmen and even former enemies, because they were good, not because of who their father was. He made a brutal, simple promise that ran both ways: follow me and share the spoils. Betray me and there is no corner of the earth I won't find you. He gave 1,000 feuding tribes, for the first time in history, one identity, one law, and one direction. That was the genius, not the riding. They could all ride, not the shooting. They could all shoot. The genius was unity. He took the loaded gun that had always been pointed at itself, and he straightened the barrel and he aimed it out at the settled world that had no idea what was finally coming for it whole. The army didn't get deadlier under him. It got pointed, and that made all the difference in the world. And when that gun finally went off, the settled world had no answer for it. Couldn't have, because everything that made a farming empire rich and strong was against this enemy, a weakness. A great city, the pride of a settled kingdom, was to the Mongols just a fat, slow target that couldn't run away. The farmer soldiers, dragged off their fields and barely trained, were facing men who'd been fighting from horseback since before they could read. The settled army's supply train, that long, vulnerable tail of grain wagons, was a thing the Mongols simply didn't have and didn't need. Every man carried what he required, ate his own herds, and lived off the land the way he'd lived his whole life. While the kingdom's army crawled, tied to its supply lines, the Mongols moved like weather, like something you don't fight, just endure. And the speed, those strings of horses, those lifelong riders, meant a Mongol army would appear where it could not possibly be, hundreds of miles from where it was last seen, before word of its coming had even arrived. Settled generals kept fighting the war they understood, and kept losing to a war they didn't. I want to be square with you about the cost, because it was monstrous. When a city resisted, the Mongols could erase it. Whole populations put to the sword. Cities turned to empty fields. Numbers of dead so large the chronicles can barely hold them. This is not a story with clean hands. The same machine that was so terribly efficient at conquest was just as efficient at slaughter. I am not here to wash that off. The thing can be a marvel of grim engineering and a horror at the same time. And this was both. So step back. I'll tell you what I saw. I saw the deadliest army in history, and I saw that almost none of what made it deadly was built on purpose. The riding, the shooting, the toughness, the way they moved and fed themselves across brutal country. All of it came free, as a side effect of a hard life lived close to animals and open land. They didn't train an army, they just lived. And the living made soldiers of every one of them, and they never knew it was strange. For thousands of years, that terrible power sat on the steppe doing nothing to the wider world, because it was aimed at itself. 1,000,000 born soldiers too busy with their own feuds to ever unite. The settled empires mistook that for safety. It was never safety. It was just a gun pointed the wrong way. And then one hunted, betrayed boy did the only thing that had ever really mattered, not making the soldiers. They were already made, but getting them to face the same direction at the same time. He didn't invent the Mongol war machine. He aimed it. And for one terrible generation, the bill came due for every settled empire within reach. Here is what I rode away with, and I'll hand it to you plain. The most dangerous force in the world is rarely the one that looks the richest or the strongest. It is the one whose ordinary way of living happens to be, when somebody finally organizes it, a weapon. The Mongols didn't beat the world because they were given more. They beat it because they were given less. A land so hard that just surviving it forged exactly the people who could take everything from everyone who had it easier. There is a lesson in that older than any empire. Sometimes the softest ground raises the people you most need to watch, and sometimes the hardest ground raises the ones who come for them. Ride with me.